For this video I am retesting gaming performance on Windows versus Linux, but this time I'm also adding NVIDIA benchmarks. And I can tell you right away that some of the results that you'll see here will still blow your mind. And again, I am a noob when it comes to Linux, and the only things that I know, the few things that I know, is because I wanted to learn them in order to make these videos. And the results you see here are from testing Windows 11 24H2 versus Nobara 41 Linux, and all I had to do here was basically enter my Steam account because Steam comes installed, set the compatibility mode on Steam, which automatically downloads Proton, a translation layer from Valve, and then downloaded Proton GE from the Nobara Proton app, since Proton GE usually runs better than the normal Proton in most games. And it was done. Every single game running out of the box just by doing these steps. Just go there, install the game, run it, and it plays. And again, the only games that didn't work were the games that had really picky anti-cheat engines like Battlefield games, like Call of Duty games that need those kernel anti-cheat systems like Valorant, for example. But the game would work. What doesn't really work is the anti-cheat system, so yeah. And if you want to play games outside of Steam, it is also very simple. Nobara 41 brings a software called Lutris that allows you to play games from GOG, Epic Store, Ubisoft Connect, and EA App. And of course you can also use the Heroic launcher that allows you to play all your games from GOG, Epic Store, and Amazon Prime Store as well, which is pretty neat. And of course it is also more user-friendly. Like today's sponsor. Today's video sponsor is GVG Mall, bringing you lots of software deals like Windows 10, Windows 11, Office 2019 or 2021 with a new Windows 11 design, and for all of these you can use my SKG discount code for 30% off, getting a Windows 11 serial key for $22 and a Windows 10 one for only $15. Then use the key on your Windows settings and you'll have an activated system. So again, all I did was download the Nobara 41 ISO, install it on an NVMe, and then kind of install Proton GE since Steam already came installed. After that I just downloaded the Heroic launcher in order to play or to test games from my GOG library, and that's all. And this means that anyone that can do a clean Windows installation nowadays, which is pretty simple to be honest, can do a clean installation of Nobara 41 as well and make it ready to play. And as I stated in my previous video, people that used Linux like 10 years ago might find this odd, but really, Linux is really easy to use nowadays. The AMD drivers, for example, are built in the kernel, meaning that you don't really need to install absolutely anything to make it perform the best it can, because it comes with the Mesa drivers already, and the NVIDIA drivers are accessible through Nobara's driver manager, the same way that you can get the latest Mesa drivers through it as well, or if you want to install CUDA, or if you want to install ROCm as well. It's just that simple. Nobara driver manager, and you're good to go. Click install and you're good to go. And now that you know how I made things work, let's see the results. Starting with Witcher 3 and the RX 7900 XTX, and like my previous testing on the RX 6800, we have the Witcher 3 performing better on Linux at 1080p, being 11% faster than Windows 11. At 1440p and 4K, even though we have around the same average FPS, the 1% lows had massive decreases, possibly showing some of the issues that Proton might have with this game, I don't really know. As for the RTX 4080 Super, the 1% lows are much better, but at the same time, the average FPS are constantly lower, being at 1080p for example, around 11% slower on Linux when it was 11% faster with the AMD card. On Counter-Strike 2 I was finally able to test the game natively, as Mango HUD got updated and I was able to launch the game with it enabled now, because I use Mango HUD for, well, recording the FPS and so on. And since we're not running Proton, we have Linux delivering better performance at 1080p and 1440p, losing only at 4K, where Windows somehow got higher 1% lows at the other resolutions, thing that also happens with the RTX 4080 Super, but even when running natively the NVIDIA card shows less performance on Linux, as drivers still need polishing. Moving now to the maximum settings and 4x MSAA, we have the RX 7900 XTX delivering more FPS at 1080p once again, and delivering slightly less at 1440p and 4K. While with the RTX 4080 Super, we have, well, more stable results overall, with Linux virtually matching Windows at 1080p, but with the same being 7% faster at 1440p and 16% faster at 4K, which is quite a big difference. Plague Requiem is one of those games that performed consistently better on Linux with the RX 6800, but it seems to have some sort of issues when going above the 120 FPS mark, because even with the RX 7900 XTX, Windows was 24% faster at 1080p, and even at 1440p and 4K, where Linux was basically on par with Windows, it had much lower 1% lows. And things were much worse with the NVIDIA card, where even though we had higher 1% lows on Linux when compared to the AMD card, Linux is only able to match the performance at 4K, with Windows being 50% faster at 1080p and 30% faster at 1440p. As for Cyberpunk 2077, both systems perform around the same with the RX 7900 XTX, with Linux having a drop in the 1% lows at 1080p, but the NVIDIA card takes a huge performance hit once again, with Windows being 24% faster at 1080p, 22% faster at 1440p, and 19% faster at 4K. As for Robocop Rogue City, it is our first Unreal Engine 5 title here, with Linux performing extremely well, with the RX 7900 XTX being slightly faster than Windows. Not by much, but having Linux performing better than Windows is always a nice surprise. Surprise that sadly does not happen with the RTX 4080 Super, that is much slower when using Linux, with Windows being 21% faster at 1080p, 26% faster at 1440p, and 29% faster at 4K. Banishers Ghosts of New Eden is an awesome game that is generally not that heavy, but when it comes to the village areas the CPU gets punished a lot. Maybe that's why we see Linux with the RX 7900 XTX being 12% faster at 1080p and 6% faster at 1440p, losing only slightly at 4K. This even when using Proton as a translation layer, which is very impressive. Although, as we move to the NVIDIA card, we see more of the same, with Linux constantly underperforming, especially in GPU-driven scenarios like 4K, where Windows delivers 28% more FPS. NVIDIA really needs to improve their Linux drivers, I believe. Hellblade 2 it is, and while the RX 6800 performed around the same in this title, the RX 7900 XTX does deliver better performance when running on Linux, with the same being 9% faster at 1080p and 8% faster at 1440p. It does have slightly lower 1% lows though, which is a bummer to be honest, but a bigger bummer is the RTX 4080 Super performance here, that is just complete crap, with Windows being 26% faster at 1080p and 22% faster at 1440p and 4K, which is a huge performance hit to be honest, so damn son. As for Black Myth Wukong, or as I like to call it, BMW, the AMD card delivers once again very nice performance on Linux, being faster than on Windows across the board. Yes, even when using Proton as a translation layer, or whatever you want to call it, Linux delivers a considerably better experience, especially at 1080p, where it was 10% faster while delivering much higher 1% lows. But sadly that's not the case with the NVIDIA card, that just refuses to work properly on Linux, being much slower at all resolutions. Again, very poor results for the NVIDIA card here. The RX 7900 XTX when running Homeworld 3 performs considerably well on both Linux and Windows, which is again within the expected, with Linux usually underperforming at higher resolutions. And talking about underperforming, we have the RTX 4080 Super on Linux. And I must say that the difference isn't that big this time, at least not at 1080p and 1440p, because at 4K, Windows 11 is 15% faster, and smoothness-wise going from 76 to 87 FPS can be felt in real-world scenarios, but generally not one of the biggest differences that we've seen. Resident Evil 4 was one of those games where we had slightly better performance on the RX 6800, but things are different with the RX 7900 XTX that is slower when running Linux at 1080p and 1440p. Resident Evil is also the first game where the RTX 4080 Super doesn't lose performance at 4K when running Linux. The closest we had was Plague Requiem, but it still had lower 1% lows. This is all to say that people playing this game at higher resolutions will be fine most of the times with the RTX 4080 Super. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is our 5th Unreal Engine 5 game, and again we have the RX 7900 XTX performing exceptionally well on Linux, matching or outperforming Windows 11 by a little even when using Proton GE. But man, as soon as we move to the RTX 4080 Super, it is like watching a horse racing a pony, with Windows 11 being 18% faster at 1080p, 24% faster at 1440p, and 30% faster at 4K. Insane. As for God of War Ragnarok, it is one of those games that I really enjoyed playing, and I could still enjoy it on Linux that delivers slightly less performance at 4K, but 10% more FPS at 1080p. This with the RX 7900 XTX of course, but the moment we change to the RTX 4080 Super, the results are just outrageously low. I mean, with Windows 11 being 37% faster at 1080p, 31% faster at 1440p, and 27% faster at 4K. Maybe next time I need to benchmark the closed drivers, I guess. As for Silent Hill 2, the results are virtually equal on both Windows and Linux when using the RX 7900 XTX, which is great. Not so great on the RTX 4080 Super though, where the game is playable for sure, but the performance drop turns the RTX 4080 Super into a 4070 Super, and for a performance downgrade I might as well just take the RTX 4070 Super and get the lower power draw as well. Overall, pretty disappointing here. In the previous video that I made, Space Marine 2 showed a strong performance on Linux when compared to Windows 11, when testing of course the RX 6800. But again, it seems that after the 120 FPS mark, I don't really know what's happening there, Proton seems to have issues with some games. And that is why we see Windows 11 delivering more performance at 1080p, which is unusual, but with Linux delivering 8% better performance at 1440p and 6% better performance at 4K. With the RTX 4080 Super, things are just generally a pain in the ass, with Windows 11 delivering more FPS at 1440p than Linux at 1080p. NVIDIA cards desperately need a better driver support on Linux. Moving to Riftbreaker, we're firstly testing the CPU performance, but now with ultra ray tracing settings to see how things flow in terms of Vulkan translation layer, and even with the AMD card we get Windows performing consistently better, and that's because we're using ray tracing of course. On the other hand, the RTX 4080 Super actually surprised me on this game, with Linux being quite close at 1440p and very close at 4K, something that I wasn't really expecting, especially when running ray tracing. The GPU benchmarks shows more of the same, I guess, with the RX 7900 XTX performing quite well in both operative systems, and with the RTX 4080 Super being again a nice surprise, delivering very good performance on Linux as well. Getting closer to the end, we have Palworld. This is one of those games that I always thought it was underperforming on the AMD cards under Windows, and seeing it performing constantly better on Linux even with Proton GE as a translation layer makes me think that with proper improvements it could perform much better on Windows, which is exactly what happens with the RTX 4080 Super. To no one's surprise, with Linux performing, well, decently, but with Windows being 24% faster at 1080p, 28% faster at 1440p, and 34% faster at 4K. And now we have the Thaumaturge, where again the RX 7900 XTX is virtually on par in both operative systems, having much better 1% lows with Linux at 1080p, which is great. That's sadly not the same with the RTX 4080 Super, that is again considerably slower when using Linux, but this time not by that much, being only around 9% slower at 1440p and 8% slower at 4K, which is actually pretty acceptable. And the last game tested is Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, where the RX 7900 XTX is showing a very good performance uplift when using Linux, being 18% faster at 1080p, 16% faster at 1440p, and 13% faster at 4K, and going from 50 to 57 FPS does make the difference for sure, believe me, in terms of smoothness. And this is one of the few games where the RTX 4080 Super performs well, even on Linux. It is a bit slower than Windows for sure, but nothing that you could really feel in a real-world scenario, let's say. So let's hope future games are more like this on the NVIDIA side. With this all said, with the RX 7900 XTX, we're looking at a 2% performance increase at 1080p, the same exact average performance at 1440p, and around 2% performance loss at 4K, which is very impressive considering that all games besides Counter-Strike 2 were using Proton as a translation or conversion layer, and even with that extra power needed for Proton, Linux still delivered an awesome performance. Maybe due to better driver optimizations on Linux since the drivers are on the kernel. When we're talking about the RTX 4080 Super though, things are very different sadly, with Linux delivering only 86% of Windows performance at 1080p, 87% at 1440p, and 90% at 4K. This means that you will lose from around 10 to 20% performance on average when moving to Linux from Windows with the RTX 4080 Super. Of course, if you're using the open drivers as I did, which are the basic thing for any user that goes into Linux for the first time. Which of course might not be the best answer because I didn't really test the closed drivers, but it is the easier one for every single one that goes into Linux. But even the open drivers are getting better, I guess. And well guys, here we are in the conclusion, and as you saw, Linux is just a big yes for AMD right now because in most scenarios it actually brings bigger or higher performance than Windows, which is actually very surprising once again. It happened the same with the 6800, of course, and when we're talking about overall performance, the overall performance is actually around the same, like in between 2% around the same for the AMD card for the 7900 XTX, because I did want to leave the 7600X 3D as the processor for one reason, because I wanted to see, for these top tier cards, I wanted to see the 1080p results, because most of the 1080p results will be CPU bottlenecked, hence why I left the 7600X 3D there. Then we have 1440p, which is kind of bottlenecked in some cases, but not all the time, and then 4K. And that's exactly why I left the 7600X 3D there, and I tested it with these top tier GPUs for now, in order to see those three scenarios. So, kind of CPU bottleneck in both systems, Linux and Windows, kind of mid-term at 1440p, and full GPU bottleneck at 4K. And we saw what we saw. In some case scenarios, in a CPU bottleneck scenario, Linux performed much better on AMD, like with Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and of course you have ROCm natively on Linux as well, so you don't really need the Linux subsystem on Windows in order to use your productivity to the most that you can. In Linux, it just runs natively. As for the RTX 4080 Super and NVIDIA drivers, things were actually pretty different. First of all, NVIDIA does have two kinds of drivers. The same that we have on the AMD. AMD we have the Mesa drivers, which are usually the better ones, and then we have the official AMD Vulkan ones. Again, with usually the Mesa drivers being the best, from what I heard or from what I read at least. And on the NVIDIA side, we also have two drivers. We have the open driver, which is the one that I use here, because again, it is the one that most users will use because it's just going to the driver manager, install it, and you're good to go. So most people will use this one, and if you really want to use the command line and so on, you can go and get the closed driver from NVIDIA. Again, I don't really know if the closed driver performs better than the open one. I honestly don't know, so I'm not making here biased benchmarks. There's no point in doing that. I just don't really know. And the closed drivers were kind of a pain in the ass to install. It broke my Linux installation. I had to reinstall it again. So that was a pain in the ass indeed. So I just kept the open drivers that worked well. Generally, they really worked well. And there were no issues, there were no crashes, besides some really picky things, like for example, let me just see here. So the only real issues that I found with the NVIDIA drivers on Linux were that sometimes the shaders wouldn't load properly on Steam. It would take longer to load the shaders there than with the AMD card, and a black screen after too much time of inactivity. Even if I went to the power options and set the power options to not do anything, it just, after some time, I would just have a black screen if I wasn't messing around with the computer, but besides that, it just works fine. If you just kept messing around with your computer using it, it just was fine, no crashes, no issues whatsoever. Still on the NVIDIA cards, there was one thing that I found, and it was with the Proton compatibility and Proton performance. Now, with the AMD card, I used Proton GE for every single testing, and it worked perfectly. And I even tested some games on Proton GE versus the normal Proton or versus the Proton Experimental, and Proton GE was always better. So I used Proton GE for all the benchmarks. On the NVIDIA card, things are actually different, and when I was testing the Thaumaturge, Steam automatically downloaded one part of the Proton called UMU Proton. And the Thaumaturge was actually crashing a lot at 4K and having lots of stutters with Proton GE. So I actually tested with the UMU Proton and it was much better. And there were some games that were running fine at 1080p and 1440p, but as soon as I went to 4K with Proton GE, the performance was just a mess, and we would have stutters here and there, and it was really bad. And for those games, instead of using Proton GE, I used the UMU Proton, and the performance, well, while it wasn't really high, the performance was way smoother. And those games where I used the UMU Proton were the Thaumaturge, Plague Tale Requiem, S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, God of War that wouldn't even boot with Proton GE on the NVIDIA card, I don't really know why, but the UMU Proton worked fine, and Robocop Rogue City. So those games performed like crap with Proton GE, but as soon as I used the Proton UMU, they were just fine and worked with no issues. Now, if you ask for my opinion, when using Linux, Linux is actually fine, and I really got used to it in the past couple of weeks where I started testing it and using it as a daily driver mostly, and I kind of got used to it. There are still some applications that don't work on Linux, mostly applications for benchmarks and so on, but generally, almost all of them besides those games with anti-cheats do work on Linux or have workarounds to make it work on Linux. If you are going for full productivity, and if your software works on Linux like DaVinci Resolve and some others, then you can just go for Linux without any issues, especially if you're using an AMD card. And if you're an NVIDIA user, you have an NVIDIA card and you want to try Linux, go ahead. It just works. Again, it just works, but in terms of performance and so on, you're just much better with Windows, like you saw in this video. As for the AMD cards, it was actually a very interesting benchmark, and in some case scenarios, you can actually get better performance on Linux, even using translation layers, than you do have on Windows. So it is what it is, I guess. So hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share it as well, because that really helps a lot. And this video took a lot of time to make, really a lot of time to make. And one of the reasons that I made this video was because the last video really had lots of people watching, and I really appreciate it. Really, thank you guys. Lots of people watching the performance of Linux versus Windows in gaming. And I said indeed that if the video had at least 50,000 views, 1,000 views, 100,000 views, not 1,000, 100,000 views, that I would make another one. And we now have currently 100,000 views, I believe. So thank you very much. I hope this one has the same or even more views, since it took way more time to make. But yeah, it is what it is. Thank you once again, and see you in the next video, guys. Cheers.